A monumental win. That's how U.S. President Donald Trump described a pledge by NATO leaders to increase defense spending to 5% of each country's GDP. His call for European members to take more responsibility for funding their own security dominated the alliance's short summit in The Hague, where leaders also expressed their ironclad commitments to defend one another if attacked.
NATO leaders' agreement to spend 5% of their GDP on defense by the year 2035 is one historic headline from this NATO summit, but it's only part of the reason European allies are feeling more secure now.
I watched the heads of these countries get up, and the love and the passion that they showed for their country was unbelievable. I've never seen quite anything like it. They want to protect their country, and they need the United States, as it's not a ripoff, and we're here to help them protect their country.
In addition to underscoring his commitment to NATO's all-important Article 5 collective defense, the U.S. president had warm words for his Ukrainian counterpart, after a meeting which had been a source of much worry in advance that the two might clash, and a bonus for Zelenskyy and NATO.
Vladimir Putin really has to end that war.
While perhaps even more positive than NATO could have imagined, this outcome was not by chance, but the result of hardcore choreography. Trump got the royal treatment in The Hague, literally, the only leader to stay overnight in the Dutch king's palace. And he received so much adulation from NATO chief Mark Rutte that it became a summit talking point in itself.
Is this the way that you feel that you have to act when doing business with the US president, through flattery and praise? Isn't it a bit demeaning, and doesn't it make you look weak?
No, I don't think so. For example, when it comes to making more investments. I mean, would you ever think that this would be the result of this summit if he would not have been re-elected president?
And the flattery even extended beyond NATO business.
And when it comes to Iran, the fact that he took this decisive action, very targeted, to make sure that Iran would not be able to get its hands on a nuclear capability, I think he deserves all the praise.
Although some European leaders would have liked to see stronger language for Ukraine and against Russia.
So I am returning back to Lithuania relatively happy.
What signal does it send to the Kremlin, though? I mean, if they know you can't agree even to call Russia the
No,
aggressor?
I think it's bad news for them. The meeting, the declaration, and the general spirit at the table is bad news for them.
Once the summit euphoria wears off, there's hard work ahead, hard math, to ensure that this promised spending surge moves from paper to power. Spain and Slovakia have already said they're not on board, but those are battles the military alliance will fight another day.
A very warm welcome to Gebrielius Landsbergis, the former foreign minister of Lithuania. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We have President Trump declaring this 5% defense spending pledge a monument to victory. And from your perspective in Lithuania, with its borders with Russia and Belarus, do you see this as a transformational shift for NATO or just symbolic?
Well, first of all, it is a step forward. There's no denying it. So that NATO has a conversation about increasing its defense targets, that sounds like a good deal. The main problem that I see with the NATO summit that just ended is the ambition. It looks like the biggest battle that the officials, representatives from the countries, leaders wanted to win was the battle with President Trump. And now they're happy that they were successful in this. They were happy that Trump is happy and that that the resolution was adopted. But my point is that the main battle, why NATO has been formed, why do we have these summits, is not with our allies, but with our opponents. And the main opponent, President Putin, is waging war in a European continent. And I don't think that it has been reflected to a needed level at this summit.
There are certainly plenty of challenges ahead for many NATO members to meet this pledge. I mean, many of the countries are facing their own economic challenges, cutting into welfare programs to get that money into military budgets. And I'm curious whether you think Trump's tariff war is likely to make it even more difficult for member states to hit these targets.
Yes, indeed, it could be. But I understand that tariffs were not really discussed in a connection to NATO targets. Maybe that will diffuse some of the tensions that President Trump now believes that he won the war on 5%, and maybe that kind of gives him an incentive not to push the country so much on tariffs. Because there was a phrase today that President Trump used during the press conference when he was asked about Spain and about Spanish reluctance to reach the 5%, and he said, "Well, if they're not going to do that, if they're going to free ride, I'm going to push them through trade." So it kind of gets us back to the idea of tariffs, and maybe then kind of he would use a leverage of tariffs on Spain. How that would be possible, we would need to see in order to get them to agree on 5%. But there is also a bigger challenge here, because we've seen that not only Spain, but also, as you mentioned, quite a lot of countries are reluctant to reach the 5% target, and that remains to be seen whether the target itself will not only remain on paper.
And will Lithuania be pushing for ways to create mechanisms that help enforce this target, so that you could potentially penalize countries that aren't doing their bit?
Well, it's incredibly difficult to do that. There is a statement in NATO declaration that the countries will need to provide a roadmap how they're going to reach the 5%, and then again will need to make declarations every year how successful they have been. But then again, I'm not overly optimistic about this. I don't think that that this is going to be an easy path forward. And the biggest problem here is that, on the other hand, what I mentioned is that we have chiefs of intelligence, such as German chief of intelligence, coming out and saying, look, the next 2 to 5 years will be the most dangerous years for NATO. And then we talk on a political level about the targets that go very far into the future. Basically, we're talking about 10 years when we are going to meet the 3.5% target, while the most dangerous years are just couple of years ago from now in the future.
Now, something else that's been raising eyebrows was Donald Trump's comments on his way to The Hague, where he said that his support for NATO's mutual defense clause depended on the definition of Article 5. And now he said that he's with NATO all the way. But from where you stand, does this kind of back and forth alarm you?
Well, yes, indeed. That has been discussed on the margins of NATO summit. People were concerned and confused. I mentioned that if we are confused, so maybe Vladimir Putin is also confused. And if he's confused, then maybe he is not sure whether he would be able to attack NATO, because maybe Americans are here. Maybe their commitment hasn't changed. So it's a bit of a comical situation, but it allows us a bit of a uncertainty that works, honestly, both ways, both for Putin and both for us.
Wouldn't it be better for Putin to think that there is a strong, ironclad U.S. commitment to intervene in the case of an attack on one of the Baltic states, say?
Of course, it goes without saying. Of course, we would prefer that Putin is sure that there would be a response. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. Not anymore.
Now, the summit communique that came out also gave relatively little airtime to Ukraine, even though Zelenskyy met with Trump, which Trump said was a good meeting, and he also met with others. Is that a worrying sign of Ukraine fatigue setting in?
Yes, indeed. The last two summits, one in Vilnius and one in Washington, had made pledges to Ukraine. I wish we could have been even more firm when it comes to Ukraine accession to NATO in 2023 and 2024. We missed that opportunity, unfortunately. But now we're stepping even further away from that. So that can, there is a potential that could create a lot of bad atmosphere in Ukraine. They can start feeling betrayed, and we really would not want to see that. A country that in the fourth year of the war, feeling a cold shoulder from its allies is really not the message that we would like to be sending.
Now, I want to take a look at an example of what Lithuania has been doing. This week, it signed a deal with the U.S. defense firm Northrop Grumman and Norway's Nammo to secure ammunition production. How quickly do you think other allies will be to do deals with international defense contractors?
Well, I mean, it's a tough thing because it is not easy to start the production, right? So, to build a factory, even to build a line of production, it takes time. And what happened through the last 3 years after the full-scale invasion started in Ukraine was that many companies did not believe that the pledges to finance defense industry to procure more were actually genuine. That means they did not do the investment. So we still have rather limited capacity when it comes to production of ammunition, of equipment, and tanks and whatnot. So that has been, a lot of time has been wasted. So now my hope is that maybe through the pledges of 3.5%, maybe through the pledges of German government to spend $500 billion on defense, maybe that would restart the industry so that it would really start looking into how to invest more and starting building the lines that would produce the equipment that it is needed in the countries. Well, Lithuania is one of the examples, and I would say that why you see these messages coming from our capital is because the threat is felt very rarely here. That's the main difference from this part of Europe and a big part of that doesn't feel the threat.
Gebrielius Landsbergis, former foreign minister of Lithuania. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions.
Well, many NATO leaders had been holding their breath that this summit would go well and have been heaping praise on Trump for making this spending boost happen. I asked our correspondent Teri Schultz if he deserves the credit.
Trump had been talking about wanting allies to raise their defense spending to 5% since he was on the campaign trail, even before he got elected. So once he came into office, it was pretty clear that they were going to have to make this happen or risk his wrath, which nobody wants to see at NATO headquarters, that's for sure. So I think without that kind of pressure, without the fear that doing otherwise could make the U.S. pull back its support for NATO, some of the resources which are desperately needed by the alliance if it ever came into conflict, they knew that they had to make it happen. And it's not just raising defense spending to 5%. They also had to very carefully choreograph the summit so that nothing else could go wrong. They were deathly afraid that bringing Ukrainian President Zelenskyy and President Trump into contact could result in some kind of a clash. So that was another thing they were holding their breath about. And as you mentioned, that meeting went very well. So I think that there are a lot of champagne corks being popped in the back rooms here in The Hague today.
Let's talk a little bit about what this will actually look like. Teri, can you talk us through what is in the Hague Defense Investment Plan?
Yes, so the 5% is split into two parts. 3.5%, which would really sort of be the follow-on from the 2% pledge that we often talked about that was made back in 2014. And that's the core defense spending of a country, what it spends on its own troops, what it spends on making sure those troops would be ready to go to battle if they had to, on its equipment, making sure everything, again, is in good shape. Also on spending for the capability requirements, as they're called, which are the obligations that each NATO country has to NATO, to fit into sort of NATO's mesh of collective defense. Then there's 1.5%, which hasn't yet been strictly defined. So they're talking about cybersecurity being included in that, military mobility, so upgrading bridges and roads that forces would have to use to get to a battle, primarily toward the front line. Even things like whole of society resilience, getting your citizens ready in case there were to be an attack. We've talked a lot about that. So there could be a lot of things that go in the 1.5%, and I do expect to see some creative accounting on that side.
And for more, let's bring in Aylin Matlé, a senior research fellow in the Center for Security and Defense at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome. So NATO members committed to up their defense spending to 5%. How realistic is that goal, especially when you think about the fact that some countries like Germany are struggling economically?
Well, I think we really have to look at the declaration that was published earlier today, because in the declaration it says that allies are supposed to spend 5% on defense as measured against GDP, as opposed to saying all allies are supposed to do that. And I think while that might sound like a semantic triviality, it is not, because wording really matters in those kind of documents. And I think that should really be interpreted as a sort of bridge, especially for those countries in the south of Europe who are struggling, fiscally speaking, to find some leeway and some wiggling room in terms of spending that much money on defense or defense-related matters. And then we also have to bear in mind that none of the NATO members are supposed to spend that much on defense overnight, but instead they have a 10-year framework to work with and to work in. And especially Germany, with the adaptation and the change of the constitution that was passed earlier this year, Germany is really in a comfortable position to actually spend 3.5% on hardcore defense matters, which we've just heard a couple of days ago, actually yesterday, is supposed to be reached already in 2029.
Now, just so I understand you correctly, do you think that this promise of 5% from member states was just for show to appease Donald Trump, and then that actually down the road some of them will be essentially let off the hook in reaching that target?
I wouldn't say that necessarily, but yes, of course, we have to bear in mind that all NATO members, and especially NATO as an organization, was very eager to make this summit a success, and thereby also to cater to Trump's ego, to Trump's request to spend 5% on defense matters. At the same time, if you look at the 3.5% that is supposed to go towards hardcore military capabilities and personnel, that is a number and that is a figure that has been floating around for some time now, already before Trump was re-elected, actually, because that number sort of is based also on the threat assessment and the capability targets and capability requirements that NATO has come up with already prior to Trump demanding allies to spend 5% on defense. So it's both. It's a mixture of wanting to make sure that the summit went smoothly, which overall I would say it did, but at the same time it is also grounded in military needs and military realities regarding the deterrence mission and defense mission vis-a-vis Russia.
Tell us a little bit about the challenges ahead. These commitments are not just about money, also about manpower. Germany's defense minister, for example, has said that it needs 80,000 additional troops to meet these goals. Could you just tell us what NATO partners are facing here?
That is indeed a tremendous challenge that not only Germany, but also other European NATO allies are facing with regards to recruitment, but also retention. Because over the last couple of years and decades, the armed forces of most countries have grown smaller. And now the challenge is to come up with those numbers, and Germany is currently working on that for the time being on a rather voluntary basis. But Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, has already alluded that in the bill that he wants to introduce in order to create a voluntary element to recruit people to join the army, that a mechanism is supposed to be introduced that could then be activated if the voluntary element does not suffice. In other words, it is very likely that we will, at least in Germany, see somewhat reintroduction of a compulsory element to join the armed forces, because, at least in my assessment, a voluntary element alone won't do it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today with your expertise. We've been speaking with Aylin Matlé from the German Council on Foreign Relations.